This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 23, William of Orange. William of Orange is the last, but one of the typical figures of the great 17th century drawn battle between advancing Protestantism and Catholic resistance. There were many Williams in this family, and more than one have the title of Orange. But when one talks of William of Orange, without additional words, one generally means this particular William of Orange, who became, so far as the rich men of England could make him so, the King of England at the end of the 17th century. On the Protestant side of the battle, he corresponds to, though a man of far less importance, the Catholic Louis XIV. He stands for the successful Protestant resistance which caused the battle to be a drawn one, just as Louis XIV, his contemporary, stands for the later declining but still most powerful Catholic tradition in the west of Europe. Of how far Louis XIV fills this role, and how the very fact that he does not fill it altogether, but only in a mixed way, is characteristic of the time, I shall describe in my next chapter. William of Orange, the antagonist of Louis, is then typical of the Protestant side of the drawn battle in every way. To begin with, he is typical of the way in which the great leaders who made the survival of Protestantism possible and secured its further expansion were not, as had been the early zealots of the Reformation, men chiefly occupied with religion. They were men chiefly occupied with political power, and to an almost equal, sometimes to a greater extent, with the great personal income to be derived from political power. They were not men chiefly marked for their enthusiasm against the Catholic creed and practice, but rather marked for their determination to establish their independence from the old unity of Europe, and men who depended for their power upon wealth. The way in which William III came into the great quarrel was as follows. The family of which he was the head was the ancient family of the Counts of Nassau, Nassau being the name of a town and of a medieval government, district or county in the western part of Germany near Wiesbaden. These Counts of Nassau had been the officials governing the district, and their power had become hereditary and feudal not long after Charlemagne. William, therefore, was the representative of a family something like 1,000 years old. He counted among the very ancient and high nobility of Western Europe. This family of Nassau had married one of their women to the feudal chief of the town and district of Orange on the Rhone, near Avignon, just at the time when the Reformation was beginning to stir, and that is, shortly after 1500. The last Prince of Orange in the regular line died childless in the years when Henry VIII of England was agitating for his divorce, and when the Reformation in Germany was beginning to strike deep roots. He left his lordship of Orange by will to his nephew of Nassau, and thence onwards the family of Nassau, or rather the successive heads of the family, were called Princes of Orange. And yet they were only important, ancient and fairly wealthy nobles of that old feudal sort who were becoming, with the Renaissance, modern local rulers. But one of them, who came immediately after, generally called William the Silent, happened to fall heir to several very large fortunes, which all concentrated upon himself. As quite a young man, he was already one of the richest men in Europe, and had a corresponding power in the politics of the day. This William, Count of Nassau, was born a little before Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, and died, assassinated, a little before the failure of the Spanish Armada expedition against England. He was, roughly speaking, a contemporary of Queen Elizabeth, but a few years older. This elder William of Nassau, Prince of Orange, has obtained in history the name of William the Silent in rather an absurd fashion, and he certainly has no right to it. Let us see how that name arose. As a very young man, or rather boy, he had been a sort of hostage at the French court to ensure the carrying out of a treaty between the King of France and the Emperor Charles V. Many years afterwards, when he had abandoned the Catholic religion and was in full rebellion against his legitimate sovereign, he brought out a cock-and-bull story to the effect that during his youth at the French court, the king had confided to him a plot for massacring all Protestants. He himself, William, boasted that on hearing this terrible news he had been horrified, but had cunningly kept silent, and he gave it to be understood that it required no small courage and intelligence for a youth of his years to have acted so discreetly under the circumstances. The story William thus told long after in later life is an obvious falsehood. He said not a word about it between the supposed time of its taking place and the moment when, according to his account, he chose to release it. That a powerful king would have confided such a vital state secret to a lad is even less credible than the story of the plot itself, or the likelihood of the boy and the man remaining completely silent about it for half a lifetime, during years when the news would have been of vital importance. However, the times were fanatical. Almost anything was believed by one side against the other. William was astute, and he got away with it. The Protestant side of Europe affected to believe the story, which you will now see solemnly repeated in most of our textbooks, and that comic nickname, the Silent, remains attached to William and will presumably always so remain. This William the Silent, being the wealthiest and the most important subject in the Netherlands, was tempted to take the lead in rebellion against the lawful government of those countries. The lawful government was that of Philip II of Spain. There was nothing unnatural or odd about the King of Spain being thus also a monarch of a district which is today divided into Holland and Belgium. Political power over widely separated European districts went in those days everywhere by legitimate descent, and Philip of Spain was the inheritor, through the woman of the Burgundian house, of those who had been the lawful monarchs ruling the 17 provinces of the Netherlands. These provinces and their great mercantile cities had prospered under the House of Burgundy, to which they were much attached, and after that house had ended in an heiress, it seemed to them quite natural and right that her grandson, Philip, should be their monarch. But there were two troubles ahead. The first, much the most important, was the outbreak of the great religious rebellion against Catholicism, which led to rioting and fighting between reformers and orthodox all over the west of Europe. The second was the fact that the great kinships of the day were tending to become absolute and to neglect local liberties. Now the great trading towns of the Netherlands, which were the maritime emporiums for the vast traffic of the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt, Ghent, Antwerp, Brussels, Lille, Arras, Bruges, etc., had, like all mercantile communities of the latter Middle Ages, enjoyed a large measure of local self-government. They were jealous of any encroachment upon this. When the religious revolution broke out, with its violent local riots and disturbances, endless fights of reformers against orthodox, the fact that the King of Spain stood for the old orthodox tradition made it natural that those who feared for their local political liberties should in many cases flirt with the new revolutionary ideas in religion, and this they did. In other words, a considerable number of the principal merchants and rich men in the towns of the Netherlands took up Calvinism, and this new religion was also avowedly the religion of those who had broken out in the riots and looting of church property, including the accompaniments of murder and torture. The tortures which the revolutionaries had inflicted upon the monks were particularly horrible. The regular government of Philip II set out to suppress these disorders, but it needed money for the task. The money which had been sent for the paying of the troops was held up in the English ports on its way from Spain by the man who governed England in the name of Elizabeth, William Cecil. The government of the Netherlands was therefore forced to levy a special tax to replace the money. This tax, in a commercial community like that of the Netherlands, was intensely unpopular, and armed revolt broke out all over the country. This was the opportunity for the rich men who wanted to make political capital out of the troubles and increase their income at the same time. And of these, the richest naturally became the leader. Therefore, the multimillionaire, William the Silent, appeared as the chief name in the rebellion. For a long time he hesitated to abandon Catholicism, but it seemed upon the whole the card to play, for though the rebellion was not mainly religious, but mainly political and economic, Calvinism was part of the driving power behind it. Philip II, King of Spain, to whom and to whose family William had owed everything, outlawed William the Silent, and a Catholic zealot shot and killed him in the year 1584. It is characteristic of the times that this assassination took place in a convent which had been confiscated and robbed by William's family. You may see to this day the marks of the bullets against the wall by the door where he fell in the town of Delft. After that, the family of Orange, Nassau, though not uninterruptedly head of the rebels in the Netherlands, remained always the typical leaders. The second son of William the Silent was a great soldier in the struggle of the Calvinist merchants of the northern Netherlands against Spain, and when things settled down in the middle of the 17th century, more than 60 years after William the Silent's assassination, a younger son of his was the chief man in Holland, which had by this time become practically independent. The son of this chief man, whose name was William, married the Princess Mary of England, sister of Charles II. He died in November 1650, and just after his death, his wife bore the son who was again christened William, the hereditary name of the family, and he became known in English history as William III, William of Nassau, Prince of Orange, and King of England. The child born under such strange circumstances grew up of a mixed sort. He was not without energy, though it was of a morose and silent kind. He had a strong, aquiline nose, piercing eyes, and his dwarfish body, suffering from poor health and later from asthma, was not without vigor, but he was sullen and vicious. He was in general detested by those who came closest in contact with him, except the favorites whom he loaded with gifts, and who were in some unknown degree partners in his vices. The first of these was a certain Bentinck, a man of good family. Later in life, William very disgracefully took up with a too beautiful boy of unknown origin called Keppel. When it came to marriage, he had the good fortune to get for a wife his first cousin, Mary Stuart, grandchild, like himself, to Charles I of England, and daughter of James, Duke of York, who was later to be James II of England. The marriage was intrigued for, perhaps reluctantly, but at any rate decisively, by Charles II, who was King of England at the time, and who wanted to keep a foot in both camps, Catholic and Protestant. There were no children of that marriage, and the Princess Mary was next door to being deficient, so unintelligent was she. But the extreme importance of the marriage lay in this, that the wife this young William of Orange had married was the next heir to the throne of England, at the time when her father, James II, should succeed his brother, Charles II. This Mary, William's wife, had been brought up a Protestant as a piece of statecraft insisted upon by Charles II, her uncle, who was the reigning king during her girlhood. He hoped thus to save the dynasty by counteracting the effect of his brother's conversion. Mary's mother, Anne Hyde, the daughter of the Lord Clarendon, a woman of strong character and intelligence, had been converted to Catholicism, and she had brought over her husband, James, Duke of York, Mary's father, who was the immediate heir to Charles II. By the time James became king, Anne Hyde was dead. There was no boy to inherit the kingdom after James II died. James II's second wife, Mary of Modena, was of bad health and had lost her children. It was believed she would have no more. When this Catholic king came to rule, it was over in England, which was by this time Protestant as to the great majority of its inhabitants, and as to a large minority of those inhabitants violently anti-Catholic, especially in London. Yet even those who most disliked the idea of the Catholic James being king over the country, and who had intrigued against his succession, were half prepared to accept him, because they took it for granted that he would be succeeded by his Protestant daughter, Mary, the Princess of Orange. Not only was she a Protestant, but she was married to the man who was regarded as one of the leaders of the Protestant cause on the continent of Europe. It was in 1685 that James II had become English king. The discontent of the active Protestant minority led to rebellions in Scotland and in the south. They were easily put down. That in the south had been led by an illegitimate son of the late King Charles II. This illegitimate son was called the Duke of Monmouth. He had no particular religion, but he took up the Protestant cause with violence, and naturally enough, as it was his best chance of getting rid of his uncle, James II, and of capturing the throne for himself, he gave it out that Charles II had married his mother. A very large number of the more intense anti-Catholics in the country believed this legend, and a still larger number were prepared to let it pass for truth so that they might have a Protestant champion immediately at hand against the reigning Catholic king. But when Monmouth's rebellion had been put down and Monmouth himself executed, there remained, even for those who believed that Monmouth had been legitimate, no leader of the Protestant cause, no one whom they could regard as a possible substitute for James II, except his daughter Mary and her husband, James' son-in-law, William of Orange. The whole thing was mixed up with the now determined policy of the rich English families to take over the government of the country. and in their own selfish interests to destroy what was left of the power in the crown. There was not much left of such power. The crown had become the puppet of the wealthy, landed classes in England, who assumed the government of the country unchecked through their two great committees, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which were composed of their own landed class. They would far rather have had a new king, who should owe his nominal title to them, than to have the legitimate King James, who had behind him the full traditions of monarchy. But to these traditions, the masses of the English people were still strongly attached, and the wealthier classes who desired to get rid of the king and to take over the government for their own advantage could not openly upset the principle of monarchy in the face of popular opposition. It would be their object, I repeat, to have someone called king who should replace James II, but they would take care that this new king should have no real power and should be their servant. So things stood until in the 4th year after James' accession, a son was born to him, and the child lived. That changed everything. A Catholic king, surrounded by many Catholic advisors and friends, one determined to preserve royal power and insisting upon religious toleration so that the Catholic minority, which was something from an eighth of the people upwards, should have offices of trust in spite of their religion, had now an heir who would be brought up a Catholic and who ousted his Protestant half-sister Mary, Princess of Orange, hitherto the natural successor to her father. But those who were determined to get rid of James were not disarmed by this misfortune which had befallen them. There followed a series of the worst plots, conspiracies, and falsehoods in English history, a perfect orgy of lying, cheating, and betrayal. William of Orange sent over to England an illegitimate relative of his who had married an English wife, giving him the special message to congratulate James on the birth of an heir, and at the same time to intrigue secretly with anyone he could get hold of for turning James out and the newborn child with him. William of Orange further began to intrigue in Holland for the support of the Dutch. He began to try to raise money from the Dutch bankers on the securities of the taxes with his backers would, if he were made king, impose on the English. While he was doing this, he protested in the loudest manner his loyalty to his father-in-law, James, and continued to proclaim that loyalty until the very hour of sailing with a large expedition to invade James's kingdom. James had a considerable army with which to defend his throne, but the officers were drawn from the landed classes who were conspiring against the throne and were ready to betray their king. William's force landed in Devonshire. It was made up of mercenary soldiers drawn from every country, with only a few Englishmen among them. Most of the officers were French Protestants, rebels, but the strongest thing in the force was the finely disciplined and armed Dutch Blue Guards of William himself. There was no battle because just when the issue would have been joined, James was betrayed. The leader of those who betrayed him was John Churchill, later Duke of Marlborough, whose career as a soldier James himself had made. The Prince of Orange marched on London. The Dutch guards occupied the western part of that town and appeared before the palace. James was thrown out, and the rich men who had helped William of Orange made him their king. After long negotiations, he and his wife were declared equal partners, king and queen, side by side, so that the reign of the usurper is now officially known as that of William and Mary. Politically, the thing was a complete revolution, or coup d'etat, that is, an illegal, unconstitutional act of force by which a legitimate government is supplanted. The English hereditary monarchy was disposed of, and a new, unheard-of title called parliamentary title was substituted for right of birth. The legitimate king, James II, lived on in France, protected by the King of France, his cousin Louis XIV. He attempted to get back his throne with the help of the French king, both through an Irish land campaign and through a maritime one in the Channel. He failed in both enterprises and died at the beginning of the next century, within a few months of the son-in-law who had betrayed and dethroned him, and some time after the unnatural daughter who had hated her husband to act in this manner. The claim of the legitimate Stuart line was not given up, but their Catholicism was a fatal bar to their restoration, and they died out within a century. Their attempts to regain the throne all proved futile. In this way, the work of the Reformation in England was accomplished. What had been, when James II was betrayed, an active minority of the nation, about 16% of the whole, still in actual Catholic practice, and many more in varying degrees of sympathy with the old religion, dwindled to an insignificant handful. Within one long lifetime, by say 1760, the practicing Catholics had fallen to be less than 1% of the population. What was perhaps more important, the non-practicing penumbra of sympathizers with Catholicism had disappeared. The link with the old national tradition was broken forever, and when the Catholic Church began to flourish again in England, it flourished as a foreign thing, inspired first by French, later by Irish emigrants. In the great drawn battle of the 17th century, of which England had been one of the principal fields, the decision, so far as England was concerned, was complete. The Protestant cause had completely won, more completely by far than in any other country in Europe. With that victory, the name of the perverted William of Orange, though he was but a servant and a tool throughout, will always be associated.